Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be listening. Whew, sorry, early. This is chapter 27. We are moving right along into the civil rights movement. Okay, so if you'll notice the dates, 1941 and 1973, this is going on as World War II is going on, so at the beginning of World War II, and well into the 70s, and many people would argue that it lasted even in today's time, people fighting for freedom and rights and whatnot. This is going to focus largely on African Americans, but you also have women, you have Mexicans in particular, and Latinos. And into the 70s, you have the LGBT community fighting for rights and whatnot. So let's get started here. Okay, so hopefully you can identify the gentleman in the middle of that picture right there. That is going to be Martin Luther King Jr. His wife, Coretta Scott, is right next to him. And then there's another black preacher and his wife on his other side. It really kind of demonstrates the fact that the clergy, the black clergy, is involved in these civil rights movements, MLK being kind of the face of it a lot of times. Especially since he is later assassinated, he is known as kind of the face of the civil rights movement. However, please do not ever think he is the one. He is not the one who started it. He is not the one who came up with all of it or anything like that. He was a public figure. He was somebody who spoke well, somebody who's attractive, and then again is later assassinated. So, but he does have he does kind of go off those Mahatma Gandhi ideas with the nonviolent protesting and whatnot. So this happens to be the march from Selma to Montgomery, and those are both in Alabama in 1965. Okay, so let's kind of start from the beginning of this. So Jim Crow laws. These are going to be laws that were made to basically keep black people from having their 14th Amendment rights. Some southern states, especially South Carolina, Mississippi, had populations of 30 to 50% African Americans, numbering up to 15 million in 1950. African Americans were about 10% of the U.S. population. Southern states were deeply divided by race through legalized segregation. African Americans generally had no chance of working for the state or city governments in the South. Most employment is cleaning, cooking, working warehouses, loading, or sharecropping. Fewer than 20% could vote, and this is because of things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory means. So grandfather clauses, etc., a lot of different things that kept people from voting. Despite the large percentage of black men and women in the South, they really have no political power. Up in the North, they do have greater freedom, but they don't have total freedom. Northern whites kept communities segregated through housing ordinance, mortgage discrimination, police harassment, and mob violence. So basically, there were communities that didn't allow black people to purchase homes or anything like that. The picture up there, you can see the young girl at the colored only fountain, and everybody's waiting to drink at the colored only fountain. Excuse me. Excuse me. Oh, I'm allergic to history. Sorry. Anyway, but not from the white fountain. Only white people could vote for that. When you have the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling in 1896, I think. Anyway, separate but equal. And you can even see, I don't know if you can tell the difference between those two water fountains. They are clearly not equal. They're separate, but they are not equal. And so you get the Brown versus the Board education ruling later that's going to help with that. All right. So where does the civil rights movement really come from? The Second World War is going to have a major influence on the civil rights movement. Early in the Cold War, Truman said, "More and more, we are learning how closely our democracy is under observation." Concerns grew that communist nations would use race problems and propaganda against the West. So that's we're worried about what it looks like. The black middle class experienced robust growth after World War II. Its ranks produced most of the civil rights leaders, ministers, teachers, trade union leaders, and attorneys. The number of African American college students increases. The new medium of television plays a crucial role, showing the public the violence of racism and discrimination in a way that they had never before experienced. For example, the 1957 integration of Little Rock High School. The other thing you have going on. So, Executive Order 8802. This is going to be A. Philip Randolph. He led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This is going to be the largest black trade union, and it calls for a march on Washington early 1941. So this is before we're involved in World War II, but we know we're going to. I mean, FDR is not dumb. He realizes that the writing's on the wall, and eventually something's going to have to give. But they want equal opportunity in wartime industries, because even though we are not involved in the war yet in early 1941, we are definitely helping out countries that are through production. So FDR issues Executive Order 8802 to prohibit discrimination in defense industries. So Randolph cancels the marches. Fair Employment Practice Commission was created, which had few enforcement powers, but set an important precedent for federal action on race issues. So, to the point of doing a lot of talk, but not quite a lot of action yet. The other thing you have during World War II is called the Double V Campaign. So this is a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, and it's going to call for a double V, or for a double victory. Victory over fascism abroad, and victory over racism at home. Black leaders encouraged men and women to support the war efforts overseas, while calling for peaceful change at home. In New York City, employment discrimination on the city's transit lines prompted one of the first boycotts in Harlem in 1941. The founding of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, in 1943 by members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation encouraged nonviolent direct action. Alright. As we move a little further into the Cold War, so Truman supports civil rights on moral grounds, as do many of our presidents, but use racist language. Recognize the importance of the black vote in the North, so New York, Michigan, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. So he appointed a presidential committee on civil rights in 1946, which released the 1947 report to secure these rights. So Truman is the first one to make a step towards civil rights. And in 1948, he actually desegregates the armed forces and employment in federal agencies. So that's the first big move, desegregating stuff like that. It was viewed as the most aggressive president on civil rights since Reconstruction. It led to white Southern Democrats forming the States' Rights Democratic Party, popularly known as the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond, governor of South Carolina, which is going to be your gentleman right there on the left. Okay. Truman feared racism in the U.S. would discredit the American image in the world. McCarthyism and the hunt for subversives at home held the civil rights movement back. Opponents of civil rights charged that racial integration was communistic, and the NAACP was banned in many southern states as an anti-American organization. So, okay. This is migration. What a terrible map without the year. Interesting. Maybe in your book it's got the year. Anyway, internal migrations. Basically, they're moving from the south up to the north and the west for employment. And as you see, the white population is doing the same. But moving for employment, moving for better lives, etc., etc. The same reason people move today. Alright. So, a little bit about our other groups. So as far as Mexican Americans, Texas poll taxes disenfranchised Mexican Americans, meaning they were not allowed to vote. Decades of discriminatory practices in agriculture and manufacturing suppressed wages. Colonias, or barrios, which are neighborhoods of Mexican Americans, were separated from whites with substandard living conditions. Lack of water, electricity, sidewalks, and public services. Congress of Industrial Organizations helped to organize workers to demand better conditions. More than 400,000 Mexican Americans also served in World War II. In Texas and California, Mexican Americans created new civil rights organizations post-war. Activists in Los Angeles created the Community Services Organization in 1948, and veterans formed the American GI Forum in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1948. 5 Mexican-American fathers sued a school district in California for separating their children into Mexican schools. So this is going to be Mendez versus Westminster School District. The Ninth Circuit Court of California ruled such segregation unconstitutional. So sometimes you will find in these court cases that Mexican people are treated as white, and sometimes you will find that they are not treated. They were treated as a separate race. And so the reason it is deemed unconstitutional is because they say you cannot segregate people of the same race. So this is where they're considered white. As far as our Japanese American goes, in the late 1940s, Japanese American Citizens League, or the JACL, filed lawsuits to regain property lost during the war. Again, during the Japanese internment. Challenged the California's alien land law, which prohibited Japanese immigrants from owning land. So, again, we're horrible to all immigrants. Go us. Okay. So Thurgood Marshall. So after being denied admission to the University of Maryland's law school, he attended the all-black Howard University. In 1936, he and Charles Hamilton Houston successfully challenged the University of Maryland's law school's admission policy. 1944, Marshall successfully challenged all-white primaries. 1950, he successfully argued to the Supreme Court that universities could not segregate black students from others on college campuses. And this is a court case that's actually in the Texas Teaks, and it is, oh crud, what's that kid's name? It's against the University of Texas. Oh man, I'll try and look it up before class, but I have forgotten that name. It is escaping my brain right now. But again, basically, it was one of the precursors to Brown versus Board of Education, things that argued. So, I want to say his name was Howard. Doesn't sound right for some reason. Anyway, he was a student at UT Law School, and he was a black student at UT Law School, and so they had separate facilities, segregated facilities. And the court case makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court, because basically the facilities were not equal. There were very few students that it was involving, and so it was an easy case to argue, and for the Supreme Court to kind of agree that those were not equal facilities, and so they let the kid go to the main UT Law School, and he does eventually graduate from there. All right. Then we have our big landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Sweatt. Harold Sweatt, S-W-E-A-T-T. Sweatt versus the University of Texas Law School. I got it now. All right. Sorry, Brown versus Board of Education. So Linda Brown, who was a student in Topeka, Kansas, was forced to attend a segregated school further from her home instead of the all-white elementary school nearby. Marshall successfully argued that Brown was denied equal protection of the laws. On May 17, 1954, the court ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Southerners immediately began to resist. The Southern Manifesto in 1956, signed by 101 members of Congress, denounced the court's decision. The KKK membership grows. President Eisenhower accepts the law but does not really want to enforce it. And Eisenhower, oddly enough, even though he's a war hero, is kind of a timid man. He doesn't want to really make waves. So in 1957, when nine black students attempted to enroll at the all-white Little Rock Central High School, Eisenhower was forced to act. So basically, these 9 students try to enroll in school. They show up to school the first day, and they are not allowed to let it. They have the National Guard is there to keep them out. The Arkansas National Guard. They're not allowed to attend school, and the governor of the state at the time was not interested in allowing them to attend school. So it does take presidential action to help out. He sends 1,000 federal troops to Little Rock and nationalized the Arkansas National Guard, ordering them to protect the black students. And for the remainder of that year, they actually had to attend school protected by the National Guard. Here's a picture right here. So this is 6 African-American students attempting to enroll at North Little Rock High School in September 1957. It includes a large group of white boys blocking the doors to the school and 3 of the black boys who are seeking to enter the school. You can also see there is a lot of media there. The white kids at the doors display a variety of emotions, hostile and angry. Some are jeering. Some are kind of uncomfortable or passive participants. They're confused, surprised, possibly afraid because of all the things that they have been taught, etc., etc. They do eventually get to attend school, but then the governor, Orville Faubus, actually becomes an even bigger asshole and just closes the school down to fight integration. So, alright, the Montgomery bus boycotts, December 1st, 1955. Seamstress Rosa Parks, a member of the NAACP, refused to give up her seat on the bus. Now, was she trying to make a point? Not really. She was tired. She thought it was ridiculous, so she sat where she wanted to sit. She wasn't trying to start a movement. However, she does. Martin Luther King Jr. is the new pastor at the Dexter Street Baptist Church. He leads the community in boycott following Park's arrest, which lasts 381 days, over a year. Downtown lost business, and the bus company nearly went bankrupt. Ooh, excuse me. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. 1957, King co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Reverend Ralph Abernathy to provide moral leadership for civil rights activists. So one of the things that was discussed a lot in these Southern movements, led by Martin Luther King and others, is nonviolent protesting. So these bus boycotts were a form of nonviolent protesting. Another one was these sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins. So over here on the right, you have a picture of the Greensboro sit-ins. February 1st, 1960, 4 black college students began a sit-in at the whites-only lunch counter at Woolworth's, determined to sit in until they were served. The sit-in lasted 3 weeks, with students taking turns despite being arrested and harassed. The Woolworth's lunch counter was desegregated, and the movement spread. Alright, over on the right you have Alva Baker. She worked for the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and helped organize students into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC. The group led sit-ins throughout the Upper South, so North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, with more than 50,000 participants. Northern students supported the SNCC through fundraising efforts at their colleges. The other thing you have going on is freedom rides, and you can see on the map that long red line, that is going to be freedom rides from Washington, D.C. to Jackson, Mississippi. CORE organized this 1961 effort to desegregate interstate travel through the South. Buses were attacked in Alabama, and students were beaten by members of the KKK. One bus was firebombed near Anniston, Alabama. President Kennedy proceeded cautiously and discouraged the freedom rides. However, the beatings shown on the nightly news forced Attorney General Robert Kennedy to dispatch federal marshals. So President Kennedy honestly did not do a whole lot for civil rights. He wrote a letter and tried to help MLK get out of jail before he became president. I honestly feel that was a political move, though, and not one that he thought because it was the right thing to do. His brother Robert Kennedy, however, did quite a lot for civil rights. He was unfortunately assassinated prior to 1970, which is, oh no, I think he was assassinated in 1969 or 68, I think. Anyway, beside the point, he was supposed to run for president and did not get the chance. But definitely a better Kennedy than his brother, who was president. Alright. So King calls for demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the most segregated city in the United States. In May of 1963, thousands of black marchers tried to picket the city's department stores. Police troops were ordered to meet the people with violent force, snarling dogs, electric cattle prods, and fire hoses. The violence was televised. King wrote a letter from Birmingham jail as he served his sentence for leading the protesters. On July 11, 1963, President Kennedy announced plans, just plans, for a new civil rights bill. Medgar Evers, who is president of the Mississippi NAACP, was murdered in his driveway. So Medgar Evers is one of the big leaders who was killed for his actions. So, like I said, President Kennedy announces some plans for a civil rights bill June 11, 1963. He is assassinated in November. None of that legislation goes into effect until after Johnson becomes president. All right. Massive demonstration to support the planned bill. So, on August 28, 1963, King addresses 250,000 people from the Lincoln Memorial in his I Have a Dream speech. Within the movement, disagreement arose over the tactics to be taken. John Lewis of the SNCC wanted a more radical, provocative tone. Southern politicians worked against Kennedy's plans. The assassination in November of 1963 led to President Johnson making the bill a priority. It was signed in June of 1964. Title VII outlawed employment discrimination, and the bill provided an opportunity for the federal government to intervene in civil rights cases. All right, Freedom Summer. So, efforts by civil rights organizations to register voters in the South. Thousands of volunteers come from across the country, including nearly 1,000 white college students from the North. Established freedom schools and considered a major voter registration drive. 4 civil rights workers were murdered and 37 churches were bombed or burned. Excuse me, sorry. Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was founded in response to blacks being banned from the state's Democratic Party. Wanted to represent the state at the Democratic National Convention, and they were not seated as requested but gained public attention. For example, Fannie Lou Hamer. Alright. The SCLC calls for a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery to protest the murder of a voter rights activist. 600 marchers were attacked by state troopers with tear gas in clubs. Bloody Sunday was shown on national television. Johnson went to Congress with the Voting Rights Act, passed August 6, 1965, outlawed literacy tests and other devices that kept blacks from voting, provided new avenues for the Justice Department to investigate registration, and the percentage of the black students registered to vote grew from 20% in 1960 to 62% in 1971. All right, so let's talk about some more extreme. So that was a lot about nonviolent protesting, marches and sit-ins, etc., boycotting and whatnot. And now we're going to move to kind of the other side of the spectrum. So you have Malcolm X. It's going to be him on the bottom left. Most charismatic black Muslim was Malcolm X. He preached militant separatism and violence for self-defense. He advocated a program of strengthening the black community rather than seeking to change the minds of white Americans. In 1964, he broke with the Nation of Islam and his anti-white views and becomes more moderate. Traveled to the Middle East and formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He was assassinated during a speech in Harlem by 3 black Muslims on February 21st, 1965. So honestly, for most of his career, he actually preached a lot of hate. A lot of racism against white people. And he preached violence. He was all about violence. If it was necessary. So he is the extreme to MLK. Next you have Black Power. So you have CORE and SNCC activists led by Stokely Carmichael. They call for black self-reliance under the banner of Black Power. Advocated black-owned and operated institutions and businesses. Called for increased political and economic power in communities. Activists focused on poverty and social justice issues in urban areas. Other workers to end police harassment. Others worked, not workers. The attention to racial pride led some African Americans to reject white society in favor of African clothing and hairstyles. There were a large group of people, maybe not large, but there were a group of people who thought that, and Malcolm X is one of them, that basically said take advantage of what's here, but he didn't preach desegregation, he preached segregation, but he wanted to elevate the black person as far as status is concerned. But he didn't think black and white should mix. And he thought that they should just stay here until they could all afford to go back to Africa. Again, very odd, considering none of them were born in Africa. All right. The Black Panther Party, founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California. It was a militant self-defense organization dedicated to protecting blacks from police violence. They opposed the Vietnam War and supported Third World revolutionary movements. It spread from California to other urban areas. Community projects were overshadowed by their support of armed self-defense. The FBI used counterintelligence to disrupt party activities. So the Black Panther Party is going to kind of be in the middle of Malcolm X and MLK. They did not necessarily advocate violence, but they were certainly not against it. And they did carry weapons and things. They didn't often start stuff, but they were definitely in the fray. Alright. Moving to some other groups, you have the Young Lords. This is going to be Puerto Ricans in New York City. Formed the Young Lords organization. They sought self-determination for Puerto Ricans in the U.S. and the Caribbean, desired to improve neighborhood conditions, and advocated improved access to health care. Many blacks were inspired by black power to work within the political system. Elections in 1967 of black mayors in Cleveland, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana. So first black mayors. 1972 National Black Political Convention met in Gary to discuss the formation of a third political party rather than continued support for the Democratic Party. Instead, the convention created the National Black Political Agenda, which advocated national health insurance, community control of schools in black neighborhoods, and elimination of the death penalty. So. Alright, this is going to be LBJ right here. That's our friend LBJ. It's him and that's him right there. Anyway, politics of black liberation was mixed with violence in the mid-1960s. July 1964, rioting and looting followed the shooting of a black suspect in Harlem. In August of 1965, the arrest of a black motorist led to rioting in Watts, Los Angeles. In the summer of 1967, numerous riots engulfed 22 cities, including Detroit. So things are getting bad. Presidential Commission led by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner, released in 1968. That's going to be him to the left of the president. I guess to the president's right, to our left. With the black tie there. Let's see. Released in 1968, the report was a searing look at race in America and concluded, our nation is moving toward two societies. One black, one white, separate and unequal. It highlighted the poverty and frustration of African Americans in urban areas. King began to confront deep-seated problems of poverty and racism in America as a whole. He criticized Johnson and Congress for prioritizing the war in Vietnam over the fight against poverty at home, and he planned a massive movement called the Poor People's Campaign to fight economic injustice. On April 4th, 1968, King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, while supporting a strike by sanitation workers. Alright, Cesar Chavez, and Dolores Huerta. So Cesar Chavez is the gentleman right there on your right, and Dolores Huerta is the young woman over there on the left. They are both activists who work for the Community Service Organization in California on civil rights for Mexican Americans. Together they organized the United Farm Workers for migrant workers in 1962. Chavez staged a 1968 hunger strike. In 1970, victory came when California grape growers signed contracts recognizing the United Farm Workers. The Chicano movement. Concern arose over the use of the Spanish language in schools and immigration policy. The barrios of Los Angeles and other western cities produced the militant Brown Berets, modeled after the Black Panthers. Politically active students proclaimed a new term, Chicano, to replace Mexican American, and they formed a political party called La Raza Unida, or the United Race. Young Chicana feminists formed a number of organizations, including Las Hijas, or the Daughters. Okay, and our last group here, the Native Americans. So the National Indian Youth Council, Native people numbered approximately 800,000 in the 1960s, and were exceedingly diverse. Unemployment among Native Americans was 10 times the national average. The NIYC began in 1960 under the slogan, for a greater Indian America, promoting the ideal of Native Americans as a single ethnic group. Indians of all tribes and the American Indian Movement, AIM, embraced the concept of red power. IA2, the Indians of all tribes, occupied Alcatraz, demanding to purchase the abandoned prison for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, citing a precedent set centuries before by the white man's purchase of a similar island, Manhattan. AIM managed to focus national media attention on Native American issues with the siege at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, in February of 1973. For more than 2 months, AIM activists occupied a small collection of buildings. Several gun battles killed 2, and the siege was finally brought to a negotiated end. AIM protests attracted attention to tribal issues. So you have all types of people who are fighting for all types of rights during this time period, many of which were successful, many of which we are still fighting for those causes today. So we will keep plodding along. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will see or speak to you soon.